Hey, happy Tuesday. Happy book review day. Today's book is Daniel L. Everett's Don't Sleep, There Are Snakes. And this is a book my wife found and encouraged me. Well, and actually, we ended up listening to it on an audiobook during our workouts. So it was spaced out over a period of time. But it's a interesting book about essentially a missionary who goes into the heart of the Amazon with the intention of converting native people and or indigenous people, and fails kind of spectacularly, but realizes his failure and comes around. It was sold as kind of a reverse conversion story. I would not describe it as that. I would describe it as a deep intellectual goes into a scenario with one intention and then learns about the people. And he is a linguist by trade, and he goes into the jungle to try to understand their language so that he can translate the Bible into Pidwa. And then obviously they will, learn the word of God and move on is his intention. And through that process, he learns there are just some fundamental challenges to translating that. For instance, the Pidwa have no foundational creation story. They just are. And so trying to connect it to anything in the creation myth was a challenge, because they just don't believe in that. And one of the things that they do put all of their faith in is things that people have direct experience with. So if they saw something or they're accounting something they witnessed or lived through, that is truth. And that's what they want to know about. So the fact that Daniel, in this case, or Mr. Dan, or they call him a number of different names throughout the book, is trying to tell him about these stories that are long, long ago that he has no direct connection to. They're like, yeah, you're wasting our time. Like, we will never be interested in this. And it does challenge his faith. But in the process, he learns so much interesting parts about their culture, and about their language. And he doesn't ever become part of the tribe. This is a true story. I should have started with that, nonfiction. But in the movie version of this, right? Dan would become part of the tribe, or he'd be accepted, or whatever. And even though they liked his visits and included him into their tribe of sorts, uh, he was never seen as one of them. He was always an outsider, not just because he was a white man and just looked different, but his values were so different that they didn't connect with him in that kind of way. And so it's this fascinating story about this guy who sets out with this one intention and then ends up coming back with a completely different one. In the process, challenges a lot of the assumptions and research that Noam Chomsky did in terms of grammar, and this kind of idea of a universal grammar. Really gave us some interesting insight into the way language can work, and does. I mean, he reads. So we listened to the audiobook, and I'm glad we did, because he reads the Pidwa language, and I don't know that I would have been able to figure out how to translate that myself if I was reading it, in a physical book. But the stories that he transcribes in their language and then translates for you are so cyclical and repetitive, that it has a really interesting cadence to it. So it's fascinating just listening to that storytelling and then hearing the translation and then thinking about why their stories and their communication functions that way. It's also kind of funny that the Pidwa people, at least in Dan's experience, um, think I'm trying to think of a nice way of saying this. They don't necessarily look down on other people, but they definitely think they have the best life. And so, it's why would we be interested in that? We don't need that. We don't need this outside communication. We don't need a fishing pole. We have different ways of fishing. Like that's not something we do. And so there's this rejection of all these things like technologies that we would think that most people would be interested in. They see the utility of some things like the motorboat. Okay, got it. We understand. We have boats, they move slow, motorboat goes faster. I see the benefit of that. But there are other things that they just wholesale reject. I will say, if you listen to this book or if you read it, it's kind of three parts of a book. The first part is kind of the memoir story, where Daniel Everett tells about the missionary work and his attempt to go down and convert, and talks about the language some and the culture and that kind of thing. And then there's a section in the kind of middle that is very much it really is a linguistic book where it breaks down phonemes and talks about, how the language is constructed, and it's a very clinical, technical text, but accessible because he'll give you some information and then he'll unpack it. And the unpacking is often with examples and stories and those kind of things. And then the last part is kind of a return to the memoir story about his involvement in the community and then kind of what happens afterwards. So anyway, if you're looking for something a little different, and honestly, it's pretty funny at times because he records a lot of his experiences, which are just awkward and uncomfortable and kind of funny. So there were times I was laughing out loud. There were times where, like I said, it was a complicated book, dealing with complex topics that I was enjoying learning more about. And then also just kind of the being exposed to culture. Anyway, don't sleep. There are snakes. Daniel Everett. And while I would encourage you to check out the physical book, I definitely think the audiobook has a leg up here simply because you hear Dan speak the language. And it's fascinating to hear. And yeah, anyway, what are you reading?